Hi students, here we are again using the recording to go over the lecture notes. I regret that I'm not able to be on campus again today because I have a doctor's appointment in Boston that I cannot miss, and unfortunately it conflicts with our class schedule. So we're going to again have this recording and commentary on the lectures that you can access. And today, what we're going to be thinking about is European expansion. Do you remember last time how I mentioned that the world was becoming more globalized during the early modern period? With European expansion, that was definitely the case. So with the Renaissance, we saw that Western Europeans began to think of themselves and how to live in the world differently. With European expansion, Europeans now had a completely new understanding of the world itself in which they lived. So take a look at this map that we have here on the screen. Thus far, we've seen how a great deal of the historical events that we've covered in the course took place in Europe, the Middle East, North Africa, and the Far East in India. Well, take a look at this map. We have a whole new world there, don't we? The Americas. And the people of the time called America, North America, and South America the New World, of course, because they had not been aware of it. So let's explore for a little while how they became acquainted with this whole new world across the Atlantic Ocean. Before we do that, we need to establish what the historical context was. Maybe you remember I spoke of context in relation to our primary source analysis paper, being able to describe what was going on in history around the events that we're studying or about which we're reading. So here's what happened that gave way to European expansion. We've already established that the Mongol Empire was absolutely huge and that the Mongols were very interested in trading with Western Europeans. So goods traveled all the way from China to Western Europe through the Mongol Empire. Well, that was great, but as time went on, the Mongol Empire collapsed. And the other power that was on the rise, and we'll have much more to say about it as the weeks go on, was the Ottoman Empire, the Turks. The Turks, as they took control of the Middle East, came to control the spice trade from Asia. And so the Europeans understood that if they wanted to continue to enjoy trade and receiving these exports from the East, that they would have to go through the Turks, whom they considered infidels, of course, and they certainly did not want to pay tribute to the Turks who were demanding it. So in order to avoid the Mediterranean, which was starting to become dominated by the Ottomans, the Europeans came to the conclusion, you know what? We must find another way to get to Asia. And so that's what we're going to be thinking about. How did the European powers try to get there, and what did they actually find? But before that, some different things came into being during the early modern period that made such traveling possible. People now were making use of globes, so they understood that the world was in fact round, and they had new, more accurate maps they were using in order to travel. You saw one just a few moments ago. The Europeans were also enjoying greater larger ships. They increased a great deal in size. They were much larger, something like 400 to 1,000 tons. You can see the caravel on the screen. That was the type of ship that they usually use in order to travel. And with these new devices, with these better ships, Europeans were able to expand beyond the Mediterranean, beyond the Baltic, beyond the North Sea, beyond what they had always known, and were able to travel across the Atlantic, across the Pacific, so on and so forth. We begin our survey of European expansion with the Kingdom of Portugal. And the Portuguese were very interested in being able to find an alternate route to Asia by going around Africa. One of the members of the royal house, Prince Henry, who went on to be called Prince Henry the Navigator, even though he did not actually sail himself, was one of the advocates for getting to Asia this way, going around Africa. He was very supportive of efforts to explore and to expand, and it has been said that he established a school just for mariners where they could go and learn how to travel at sea. But this prince did definitely sponsor expeditions during which Portuguese explorers could go and sail along the coast of Africa and learn and get a better sense of the African continent and what could be found there. So again, around Africa, the Portuguese wanted to get to Asia by sailing around Africa. Bartolomeu Diaz in 1487 set sail from Portugal and traveled along the coast of Africa and rounded the southern tip of the continent. You can follow his route with the map on the screen. You can see he made his way down there, but then turned around. He did not go beyond the tip. The man who went beyond was Vasco da Gama. And so da Gama and his crew sailed beyond the southern tip of Africa, and in 1498 reached Calicut, India. So you can see in the map what I'm talking about. And so they traded with and engaged the Indians there, and very happily they made their way back to Europe with pepper, other spices, gems, precious goods, and the Portuguese were, of course, happy. So, mission accomplished. Asia could be reached by sailing around Africa. I know that when those of us who live in the States and have always lived in the States hear the stories about European expansion, a lot of the bad details are left out. And what happened with European expansion is some good things certainly happened, especially for the Europeans, but there were also a number of bad, evil things that came into being. One of them was the African slave trade, which began through Portuguese exploration and interaction with the Africans. So what happened was, as people were colonizing in the Americas, there were just not enough people to help on the plantations and different farms. So what did they decide to do? They decided to look to Africa for slaves who could labor on these places. This is not the type of arrangement where the Portuguese just showed up and started kidnapping people. Actually, the Portuguese and some of the local rulers in Africa came together and formed a business agreement whereby The Africans would go and capture some of their fellow Africans, people who would become slaves, and they would exchange them with the Portuguese for goods that they wanted, whether they be weapons or horses or whatever. And so the Portuguese gave the Africans what they wanted, and the Africans gave the Portuguese what they wanted. And so now we have all these African people who were going to be shipped to the Americas to work on the plantations. The African slave trade began in the 15th century with Portuguese expansion, and it's a very disturbing, despicable story about what happened. So all these Africans were captured, and that was bad enough. And then they were shipped across the Atlantic to the New World. This was a very dangerous, uncomfortable, horrible journey. The Africans were stuffed and crammed onto these ships. This drawing that you see on the screen gives you a clear sense of what I'm talking about. People were all over each other. They were strapped in below deck. They vomited all over each other. It was absolutely horrible, and they were in chains. It was expected that a lot of these poor souls were not going to make it across the ocean, so just keep cramming people into the ships. That was the philosophy. And when they arrived in the New World, the Africans, I mean, they were forced to work on the different plantations and farms, where they often encountered and had to work in very difficult, horrible conditions. They did a lot of the work cultivating sugar and indigo, very difficult crops to grow. We have some more pictures here reflecting on what the slave trade looked like. In the first image, you can see Africans who have been captured and are shackled and are being marched off to the ships. And here we have another scene of Africans being brought below deck for the terrible journey to the New World. Have you ever heard of the mini-series that was on television in the 70s called Roots? If any of you are Star Trek fans, maybe you know Geordi LaForge with that special sort of the visual device there. In this story, Roots, he played Kunta Kinte, an African who was captured by slave traders and brought to the New World. So a great deal of what I have just been talking about, capturing the Africans, shipping them overseas to go work on the plantations, an important part of Kunta Kinte's story. If you're interested in the slave trade and the fate of Africans once they arrived in the 13 colonies, which eventually became the United States, of course, check out Roots. So as time went on, the Portuguese had something of an empire. They, of course, don't have much of a not very large country in Europe, do they? But look at the green in the map. They came to control what we know of as Brazil nowadays and other areas in Africa. They were especially well known for their trade posts in the east, in India and also China. We'll mention Macau later on when we get to Ming and Qing China later on in the early modern material. So the Portuguese were known far and wide, and these are the territories and the posts that they controlled. If you have any questions, feel free to let me know. Leave a comment so I can make clarifications. So Portugal was the pioneer for European expansion. Following closely behind were the Spanish. And the first great explorer sailing on behalf of Spain was actually not a Spaniard. Rather, he was an Italian, Christopher Columbus. Maybe you've heard of him before. He sailed on behalf of Spain, but came from the Republic of Genoa in northern Italy. Columbus became very important for world history, and he had a belief about how to get to Asia. We've seen that the Portuguese traveled around Africa to get to where they wanted to be. Columbus said, you know what? We can travel an even easier and quicker route by just sailing due west. If we just sail west, we will arrive in Asia. And so he kept stressing that and communicating that idea to fellow Europeans. But nobody at first was really interested in sponsoring him and launching an expedition led by Columbus to go see if that was in fact reality. Eventually, Queen Isabella of Spain, who had just enjoyed a great victory against the Muslims in Spain, she and her husband Ferdinand drove the last of the Muslims out of Spain, and she was in a very happy, celebratory mood. When she heard of Columbus's idea, she was interested in sponsoring him. And so she provided him a fleet of 3 ships, and in 1492, off Columbus went. Columbus actually went on a few different voyages. We're really only going to talk about the first of them, which took place from 1492 to 1493. So Columbus was convinced again that if he and those with him sailed due west, they would arrive in Asia. Well, they traveled that way, and guess what? They didn't end up in Asia. They ended up in the Caribbean. They landed at San Salvador and the Bahamas. That is where they ended up, not in India, not in China, but in the Bahamas. And so what they decided to do was to take a look around and investigate, and ended up exploring the coastline of Cuba and Hispaniola. Hispaniola was the name of the island that is now the Dominican Republic and Haiti. Columbus met the people who already lived here, and he described in his writings that they were very nice, cordial, welcoming people. That's excellent, but we'll see what happened to these people as time went on and as the Spanish continued to explore and also began to conquer. Here we have a map showing where Columbus and those with him could be found over the course of his 4 voyages. So you can take a look at that more closely on your, if you'd like, on your own. The Spanish managed to accomplish even more. First off, people understood that Columbus had in fact not arrived in Asia, but found a whole new continent. And the person who made this observation was another Italian, Amerigo Vespucci. So Amerigo, America, North and South America are named after an Italian. How do you like that? So the Spanish kept exploring, and in the early 16th century, in 1513, Balboa crossed the Isthmus of Panama and looked out onto that enormous body of water, the Pacific Ocean. And it was the Spanish who first sailed around the entire world. Ferdinand Magellan, sailing on behalf of Spain, and those traveling with him, circumnavigated the entire globe. The map on the screen shows you their route. Unfortunately for Magellan, he did not make it back to Europe. He died while in the Far East. We now want to think for a few minutes about some of the people who originally lived here, some of the significant civilizations in the Americas before the arrival of the Portuguese and the Spanish. One of these civilizations was the Aztec Empire. And when we're talking about the Aztecs, we're talking about the area associated with modern Mexico. The Aztec Empire was a highly developed civilization ruled by an emperor. The emperor in this case, for the time that we're talking about, was a man named Montezuma II. They had a great capital city called Tenochtitlan. Tenochtitlan was constructed on an island. It was an enormous island city and a great center for culture for the Aztecs. And this wasn't just a big city. This was an enormous city, one of the largest cities in the world at the time. I think a lot of us in the West have the idea that when the Spanish arrived, they found lots of people living in teepees and huts and all of that stuff. No, not really. I'll show you some pictures in just a few minutes of the types of buildings that could be found in the Aztec Empire. Religiously speaking, the Aztecs were pagans. They were polytheists. They worshipped a number of gods, using human sacrifices while worshiping. The Catholic Spanish, of course, found this very disturbing. I should also note that the Aztecs had a reputation for being tyrants, for being cruel. The Aztecs ruled over a lot of different people and treated them poorly. And so they were resented a great deal. Here we have a drawing that gives you an idea of what Tenochtitlan looked like. It was built upon Lake Texcoco, a very large city. And this drawing gives you a sense of the kinds of buildings that could be found. A lot like what we saw with the ancient Near East, isn't it? These buildings that are like pyramids and ziggurats, methods of transportation, civic buildings, religious buildings, great streets and plazas, a highly developed civilization. So, what happened to the Aztecs becomes our next question. By this point in the early 16th century, the Spanish were not just interested in exploring, they were interested in conquering. These Spanish conquerors were called conquistadors. And under the leadership of Hernán Cortés, the conquistadors, having heard of the Aztecs, made their way into Mexico, made their way to the capital city, and captured the emperor. So they found Montezuma, and they took him prisoner, and a terrible military conflict broke out between the Spanish and the Aztecs. Fierce fighting. The Spanish in 1521 won. So they took control of Tenochtitlan, and with the capital taken and with the emperor no longer being around, the Aztec Empire collapsed and fell under Spanish control. The really interesting thing to point out is there were only about 600 Spanish conquistadors in Mexico, and yet they took on an entire empire and won. The question becomes, how could they possibly do that? There were a few reasons why. Remember that the Aztecs were very cruel rulers. There were lots of native Amerindians who were more than happy to come to the aid of the Spanish. So the Spanish were joined by these natives. The Spanish, of course, also had superior weapons, gunpowder, artillery, all of these things. They had horses, which the Aztecs had not seen before. And then there's also another reality. When these Europeans made their way to the New World, they brought a lot of old world diseases with them that natives had never encountered before and for which they had no immunity. So these natives contracted European diseases which their immune systems could not fight off. More on that later on. So we've seen the demise of the Aztec Empire. The Spanish also conquered the Inca Empire. Do you see the orange on the map? That's what we're talking about with the Incas. So Peru was the center of the Incan Empire. And do you see that city Cuzco on the map? That was the capital. And it wasn't just any kind of capital. People had to travel into the Andes 12,000 feet high, so traveling 12,000 feet into the Andes in order to get there. The Spanish heard the rumors that the Incas were very, very rich. They were especially well known for all their silver, and of course, the Spanish wanted it. And this is another situation much like what we saw with the Aztecs. The Incas were also cruel rulers. So what happened is that another group of conquistadors under the leadership of Francisco Pizarro made their way into the Andes with the help of the disgruntled Inca subjects and inflicted a defeat on the Incas in 1533. Cuzco fell to the Spanish, as did the rest of the Inca Empire. So all of that territory in the orange there, it was all under Spanish control now. Here we have another map, and everything in red is what the Spanish came to control during this period. Clearly, we are dealing with a global empire. They controlled the majority of the Americas. They had their own territories in Asia and in Europe. A truly powerful global empire and a European power that was now filthy rich. The Spanish treasury was filled literally with tons of silver and gold. They had brought that all back from the New World, and so Spain was incredibly powerful and very wealthy. So we now have civilization in the New World, civilization in the Old. And what's interesting with this period of time is the cultures from each area were becoming blended. So people are bringing from the New World to the Old more goods. So we've seen how they were bringing back the silver and the gold, new kinds of foods that Europeans had not had before, potatoes and tomatoes and new kinds of beans and pumpkins and all these wonderful things, encountering new animals, llamas, alpacas, turkeys, guinea pigs, all of these things. Europeans were introduced to completely new animals and new kinds of food. Europeans brought to the New World both European culture and also Catholic Christianity. So cities were being designed based on European senses of city building. Cathedrals, according to European styles. Universities. This blending of cultures is called the Columbian Exchange. So very important to keep in mind as we consider what was going on with New World and Old World civilizations at this point in history. And so we come back to this question about the people who already lived here. What happened to them? Like I was saying with Columbus, early on when they first met the Europeans, they were very friendly, very cordial, very welcoming. They became violent only when they were provoked. And trust me, the Spanish gave them plenty of reasons to feel provoked. The Spanish conquistadors and governors and colonists suggested that they be used as slave laborers and stressed that they must become Christian, or, well, I'll let you use your imagination what the Spanish would propose doing with them if they remained pagan. So they wanted to use them as slave laborers. They wanted to subjugate them. But there were people in Spain and on the ground in the New World advocating on behalf of the natives. So the Spanish monarchs said, you cannot reduce them to slavery. They are our subjects. There were also the different monks and friars, Dominicans and the Franciscans in the Americas, fighting for the protection of the natives. The very sad reality here was, as I stated earlier, the natives just could not fight the European diseases. They had never encountered them before. They had no immunity. And so entire populations were wiped out. The most devastating disease being smallpox. You can see the natives on the picture on the screen. They're suffering from smallpox. A very sad image. And those who did not die from the diseases were left the subjects of the Spanish. And so again, please feel free to let me know or to leave any comments. That is all for the European expansion lecture. And when we continue next time, it will be with the Reformation, so religious changes in Western Europe.